A mass spell took place at Trump Tower this week, which was intended to restrain Trump's power, but not necessarily cause harm. The group outside Trump Tower was a varied one. Some called themselves witches, some practiced spells and tarot but didn't identify as witches, and a few had never cast a spell before. Even singer Lana Del Rey participated, so, there's that. One woman told BuzzFeed that she is a Christian mystic named Donna who shouted a counter prayer while brandishing a mirror at the witches to reflect the spell back at them. Multiple times she called the binding spell a slavery spell because it's meant to overpower someone else's will, she said. Also, some Christians have been tweeting anti-witch prayers and religious imagery after one Christian nationalist website put out a call to action. Kat said she considered the spell a form of peaceful resistance. The main goal of the witchery is to actually do something to stop Trump, bind him, stop him, and all the horrible things he's doing in his administration, they say.
Churches across the U.S. are fighting back against the Trump administration's mandate to ramp up deportations with new sanctuary practices of their own, using private homes and their congregations as shelter and potentially creating a modern-day underground railroad to ferry undocumented immigrants from house to house or into Canada. Reverend Justo Gonzalez II, pastor of Pilgrim St. Luke's in Buffalo. We're willing to take that risk because it is our call to justice, and this is how we live our faith. Gonzalez leads one of the churches that has reached out to an organization in Canada to possibly take in undocumented families. President Trump's recent executive orders on immigration and two Department of Homeland Security memos abandon Obama-era mandates to only focus on criminals for deportation and instead put nearly every undocumented immigrant at risk of deportation for something as minor as a traffic ticket.
Trump administration is considering a few different options, most of which look like an escalation. If you remember, shortly after his inauguration last month, President Trump signed an executive order that pledged to ramp up the fight against ISIS, and he gave his generals 30 days to come up with a plan. General Joseph Votel, the head of America's Central Command, said he may increase the number of U.S. troops deployed on the ground in Syria and Iraq. The U.S. might also deploy these soldiers in more active forward positions. That's where they would be confronting ISIS directly, rather than just assisting local fighters.
The United States and our coalition partners remain absolutely committed to this very, very important operation against Daesh.
And that's not the only idea on the table. The White House apparently wants to loosen restrictions meant to protect civilians in airstrikes against Islamic State. President Trump is also considering a proposal he floated as a candidate to carve out so-called safe zones for civilians within Iraq and Syria. Even with all these proposals, the fact is that the fight against Islamic State is already being won in both Iraq and Syria. Iraqi troops are moving in on Mosul, by far the largest city under Islamic State's control. They're about to take the western half of the city after taking the eastern half last month. And now Turkish soldiers are moving in Al-Bab in northern Syria. So they're really routing ISIS in its so-called caliphate, straddling both of those countries.
On Saturday, Iran's top nuclear official has said that Iran plans to buy 950 tons of uranium ore from Kazakhstan over the course of 3 years and expects to get Russian help in producing nuclear fuel. The purchase would not violate Iran's 2015 deal with world powers over its disputed nuclear programs, as the deal did not set any limits on the Islamic Republic's supplies of uranium ore. In an interview, Ali Salehi, head of Iran's Atomic Energy Organization, told ISNA, "In nuclear talks, we reached a final agreement on jointly producing nuclear fuel with Russia."
Opponents of the Dakota Access Pipeline were pushed out of their protest camp this week. They have vowed to continue efforts to stop the multi-billion-dollar project, as well as take the fight to other pipelines. Almost 50 people, many of them Native Americans and environmental activists, were arrested. The number of demonstrators had dwindled from the thousands who poured into the camp back in August to oppose the pipeline that critics say threatens water sources and sacred land of the Standing Rock Sioux tribe. The tribe said it intends to fight the pipeline in court.
Since the 2016 election, there have been a lot of mass demonstrations against President Donald Trump and his administration. Now, Republican lawmakers across the country want to crack down on protesters. At least 18 states are considering legislation aimed at deterring demonstrators. Most proposed laws ramp up the penalties for blocking traffic. Some even protect drivers who hit protesters with their cars from prosecution. But others go a lot further. Michigan's House passed a bill in December restricting, quote, mass picketing. If signed into law, authorities could hand out $1,000 fines to picketers and $10,000 fines to organizing groups each day if the demonstration is deemed illegal. A more recent Arizona bill would make organizers financially liable for any damage if protests turn violent. It would also reclassify riots as racketeering, which can have a penalty of more than a year in prison. Those penalties concern the American Civil Liberties Union, which argues the proposed Arizona law is, quote, intended to chill First Amendment speech. Some of the bills cite the need to combat so-called paid protesters, but there's just no evidence that suggests demonstrators are turning a profit.
Paris teenagers have blockaded more than a dozen schools in the French capital and have clashed with security guards as protests against police brutality continue to rock the country. Police used tear gas to disperse the protesters. Over a dozen demonstrators were also arrested. The rally follows a recent spate of nationwide demonstrations that sparked after the alleged sexual abuse of a black man by police in a Paris suburb earlier this month. Thousands of people have taken to the streets since then. Police have made over 200 arrests. Officials have charged 1 officer with rape and 3 with assault. An ongoing criminal investigation is expected to find them guilty of sexual abuse. People have gathered in the South Korean capital Seoul to call for the resignation of the country's impeached president. Protesters say that Park Geun-hye must step down as she is surrounded by a huge corruption scandal. Supporters of the embattled president have also held a counter-rally in Seoul. Park is accused of allowing her confidant, Choi Soon-sil, to manipulate state affairs and to extort money from businesses. She was impeached and stripped of her powers last December. The Constitutional Court is yet to decide whether to uphold the impeachment.
We're going to build the wall. Don't worry about it. We're building the wall. We're building the wall. In fact, it's going to start soon. Way ahead of schedule.
That's the promise President Donald Trump made in his speech at the Conservative Political Action Conference on Friday. And not long after, U.S. Customs and Border Protection released this, a notification it will soon be taking submissions for, quote, prototype wall structures. It's the first tangible step toward meeting Trump's executive order on border security that he signed in January. Trump has said the barrier would run for 1,000 miles along the nearly 2,000-mile Mexican border. Trump routinely calls his proposed border structure a wall, but he has said before that some areas might be fenced instead. Some sort of barrier already runs some 700 miles along the border. He estimates it will cost $12 billion, but some have said a wall that's 1,000 miles long, 50 feet tall, and 10 feet below ground could cost upwards of $38 billion to build. The American people and American companies will foot the bill. Trump has said Mexico will pay the U.S. back, but Mexico's current president and 2 former presidents have said that's not going to happen.
This Tuesday, a transgender woman named Tiara Richmond, or Kiki Collier, was shot and killed on the south side of Chicago in Englewood. Richmond was shot while sitting in a car with her friend around 6 a.m. Later, the authorities brought her to the hospital and she was pronounced dead. Richmond is the second transgender woman to have been killed on the south side of Chicago recently. The last transgender woman was named Titi Safour. She was stabbed multiple times and her throat had been slit.
Global warming skeptics have reportedly asked President Donald Trump to pull out of a United Nations climate agreement. According to several reports, a group of 300 people, including some scientists, sent a letter to Trump and Vice President Mike Pence that claims carbon dioxide is not as harmful to the atmosphere as a strong majority of scientists say. The reports say the group wants the U.S. to withdraw from the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. The group argues carbon dioxide is not a pollutant and that it's beneficial for the environment because it is fuel for plants. The U.S. Environmental Protection Agency declared carbon dioxide a pollutant in 2009. Carbon dioxide and a handful of other greenhouse gases were determined to be dangerous to humans and contribute to climate change. The letter was picked up by several right-leaning outlets and blogs, which highlight its claim that limiting carbon emissions is bad for the economy. It follows a letter signed in December by over 800 scientists who urged Trump to fight climate change. There's been uncertainty over whether the Trump administration would continue previous actions against climate change. Trump has repeatedly promised to ditch the Paris Agreement signed under former President Barack Obama. The New York Times reports the Trump administration is also considering executive orders that would drastically reduce U.S. presence in the UN overall.
Should shoppers be able to use food stamp dollars to buy soft drinks and candy? The debate started after a USDA report found that 20% of food stamps are spent on sweetened beverages, desserts, salty snacks, candy, and sugar. Some members of a House Agriculture Committee hearing said restrictions on these purchases would help push people to buy healthier foods. But others said policing food stamp purchases is unfair and infringes on people's personal freedoms. The same USDA report found households that don't use food stamps purchase the same snacks at generally similar rates.
Food surveillance violates the basic principles of this great country. You can't deny them their freedoms to be able to make choices without violating their pursuit of happiness.
Do you think Congress should restrict food stamp recipients from purchasing these products? Tell us in the comments below.
It's time for your Friday feedback. We asked if you favor the president's war on fake news. Sherry Cox tweets, yes, tired of news media acting that they're better and above rules, no accountability. Fire Heather, no, I do not agree with it. The press is supposed to call out those in authority. If they don't, who does? We also asked if the Democrat Party will move toward the center or the left under a new chair. Gary Hardin, they are running to the left as fast as leadership can take them. They are leaving much of their mainstream support behind. During Alicia Acuña's story about recreational marijuana, we asked if the president should enforce federal rules against it. None your business. No. If he was smart, like he claims, he'd start collecting tax revenues from it and make it federal. Casey Kelly, yes, because it's illegal. I don't care about the facts of its benefits. I actually agree with the studies I've read. Bottom line, drugs equal illegal. And that's your Friday feedback. Thanks to all of you on Twitter, @BrettBaer, very close to 1 million followers. So if you don't follow me, @BrettBaer.
America's forests are vanishing, and according to a new report, they're also farther apart. Between 1990 and 2000, the distance between forests grew an average of almost 1,700 feet, or 14%. That doesn't sound like a big deal, but it could actually have major consequences for the ecosystem. For one thing, it can put a major dent in biodiversity. It's harder for different populations of the same animal to mate if their habitats grow too distant. But the authors of the report say that loss of forests can also affect the local climate, which might even change the types of animals that thrive in the area. The problem is worse in the West, where forests face more threats from fires and invasive species like the emerald ash borer beetle. The study also found something surprising. Deforestation is happening faster in rural forests than urban ones. The researchers say they hope their work might help change forestry policy.
Although all teens are recommended by doctors to get the HPV vaccination before they become sexually active, blunt sex education talk may be under fire now that Betsy DeVos is the new Secretary of Education. HPV is an STD that can lead to head, neck, anal, and genital cancers. Presently, there are 79 million Americans who have been infected with the virus. Most of these individuals are in their late teens and early 20s. Doctors recommend that all children between 11 and 13 should receive the HPV vaccination.